Hey guys, tonight we travel far from your electric toothbrush and that little water flosser you barely use. You're in a medieval village, let's say England though, it honestly doesn't matter. There are cobbled streets, the faint smell of manure, and a deeply aching molar somewhere in your lower jaw. You're not sure which one exactly because every other tooth has decided to ache in sympathy. The year is 1347, and your mouth feels like someone is hammering a nail into your face. Constantly. You haven't slept in 2 nights, and even your neighbor's pig is concerned by your groaning. Your options. Well, you could visit the village blacksmith who claims he once helped a horse with something similar. Or maybe the monastery where Brother Oswin has a pair of forceps he uses to pull splinters from sinners. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You clutch your jaw and shuffle through the village square. A toothache in the Middle Ages isn't just discomfort, it's dread. You know something's wrong because every breath sends sharp heat up your temple. But you don't have the luxury of Google or a warm dental office with minty gloves and pastel ceiling posters of clouds. No, your only diagnostic tool is, does it hurt when I poke it with a stick? It does. It really, really does. You bump into old Alan. He's missing half his teeth and proudly claims he pulled the last one out with a bootlace and vinegar. He recommends a poultice of moss and chicken grease. You're desperate enough to try it. Fun fact, some medieval folks actually did rub roasted onions or burnt rosemary root on their gums, hoping to ease the pain. Historians still argue whether these remedies had any actual numbing effect or were just distractions from the more painful reality of, well, everything. As you stumble toward the only person who owns anything resembling tools, you recall a neighbor who lost part of her cheek to an infection. Not a metaphor, literally her cheek. Now she smiles sideways. This is where the fun begins. The local healer is a barber by trade. He cuts hair, bleeds people, and pulls teeth, usually in that order, hopefully not with the same blade. His workspace smells like a mix of lard and panic. A wooden stool waits beside a bucket of cloudy water and a set of tools that look like gardening implements rescued from a fire. There's no anesthesia, no numbing gel, no soft music or a fish tank. You sit because frankly you can't think clearly through the pulsating throb in your jaw. The barber waves a candle in front of your face and declares you wet in the humors. You're not sure what that means, neither is he. He tightens a leather strap around your wrist, not for any medical reason but to distract you. Then he offers a swig of something fermented, possibly mead, possibly rat urine. It helps. Slightly. You don't know it yet, but alcohol is the closest thing to a sedative you're getting tonight. You sit back and notice the crowd forming. Because medieval dentistry isn't private, it's entertainment. A small boy is already mimicking your facial expression. The barber holds up his tool, an iron key-shaped contraption known as a tooth key. It looks charming until he jams it into your mouth and starts to twist. This is where most people pass out. Not you, though. You've had worse, probably. One study suggests that the tooth key actually did more harm than good, often cracking neighboring teeth or even fracturing the jaw. Historians still debate whether the original versions were developed from locksmith tools or agricultural equipment. Either way, you're starting to wish you'd chosen the onion poultice. There's a crunch, not the good kind, and then a horrible sticky pop. Congratulations, you are now 1 tooth lighter and a great deal more lightheaded. Blood trickles down your chin and you resist the urge to scream. You're handed a rag that smells like ham. It doesn't help. But the pain in your jaw slightly lessened, possibly because you're focusing now on the new pain where the tool slipped and gouged your gum. You stumble outside to applause, no joke. Public tooth pulling was a spectacle, especially on market days. Traveling barbers even set up booths to display their before and after successes, often using the same set of bloody teeth for all examples. As you make your way home, jaw wrapped in cloth, a neighbor offers you a homemade tincture to keep the demons from settling in the socket. It's mostly ale with a hint of garlic, and judging by the smell, fermented sheep's milk. You drink it, because that's what you do. Somehow you survive the night. You sleep upright in a chair, drooling into a bowl. You dream of sweet things, honey-warm bread, and the gentle absence of face pain. Congratulations! You've just lived through a medieval dental experience, and your face is still mostly intact. You wake up the next morning with your face pulsing like a church bell at midday. The right side of your jaw feels hollow, as though a squirrel has made a nest there and is kicking on the walls. You try to remember what happened. There was a crowd, a wrenching sound, possibly a child cheering. But all that remains now is a dull ache and a gaping bloody hole where a tooth used to live. There's no gauze, no antibiotics, no helpful follow-up appointment. What you have instead is a rag soaked in something vaguely minty and an overwhelming desire never to eat again. But here's the real question, who even was that guy? The one who pulled your tooth. He had a comb in his belt and scissors that looked suspiciously like hedge clippers. Was he a dentist? A healer? A torturer? Technically, he's a barber surgeon. Welcome to medieval healthcare where specializations blur, and you're never quite sure whether someone is going to cure you or bleed you out of superstition. In most towns, there's no formal dentist. Instead, a loose and frightening group of people might offer dental services often as a side hustle. Monks, for instance, especially Benedictines, were known for their work with herbal remedies and, in rare cases, dental care. But monks took vows of silence, so they probably didn't give you much bedside chatter while yanking out molars. Also, they were more interested in healing the soul than the mouth. Barbers, on the other hand, were a bit more ambitious. In addition to haircuts and beards, they performed bloodletting, wound cleaning, and minor surgeries, including dental extractions. Their signature sign, the red and white barber's pole, actually comes from the blood and bandage theme. Not exactly reassuring, but at least they were honest. And then there were blacksmiths. Yes, you heard that right. In remote villages, the guy who shod horses might also be your best shot at dental relief. After all, he had strong arms, an iron grip, and tongs. Lots of tongs. Who better to rip a molar out of your skull? Historians still debate whether blacksmith dentists were more common than we think, or if their reputation as tooth pullers comes from rare exaggerated cases passed down through oral lore. What we do know is that the line between healer and handyman was not well defined. Your town might have one person for bleeding, shaving, leeching, baptizing, and occasionally marrying people. Imagine walking into a dim room where someone is sharpening scissors and you're not sure if you're about to get a haircut or an impromptu lobotomy. That's medieval multitasking. For most of the population, trust wasn't built on credentials, it was built on proximity. The guy who happened to live closest to you and owned the fewest visibly rusted tools. That's your dentist now. It didn't help that knowledge of human anatomy was still, let's say, experimental. Dissections were rare and heavily restricted. Religious fears over desecration of the body meant that a lot of what people knew about teeth came from ancient texts, superstition, and things they could feel with their own fingers. Your average practitioner believed in the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If your tooth hurt, it probably meant one of those was out of balance, hence bloodletting. Or if they were more creatively inclined, they might suggest applying a crushed pearl paste behind your ear while fasting for a fortnight. Quacks and charlatans flourished, of course. One might claim to be a tooth oracle who could diagnose decay by reading the way you sneezed. Another might sell you an amulet made of deer teeth said to scare away mouth demons. And yet, oddly, some of their advice wasn't complete nonsense. Monks had access to classical texts from Galen and Hippocrates and used herbs like mint, sage, and clove for oral care. Clove oil in particular has genuine analgesic properties. If you were lucky, your healer might crush some into a paste and apply it with a feather. But let's be honest, you probably weren't that lucky. So here you are staggering through the day with your jaw wrapped in a bandage, no clue who just performed surgery on you, and the comforting knowledge that the same man may very well be your executioner, midwife, and neighborhood gossip. Your friend Margaret tells you her cousin saw a dentist in the city, once a real one. He had a robe, a book, and even a candle that didn't smell like fish. She thinks he was French or possibly a very clean butcher. She isn't sure. You believe her mostly because you want to. There's something comforting about imagining a future where someone specializes in mouths and doesn't also double as a guy who makes horseshoes and castrates pigs. Later that evening, you notice something odd. The pain has subsided. Not entirely, but enough that you can think without groaning. You can drink something slightly warm without screaming. You even crack a smile, but only on the non-damaged side of your face. You sit by the fire and a younger villager asks what it was like. You pause. Quieter than I expected, you say, and sip your broth. You're still sipping that slightly smoky broth when the local barber surgeon, let's call him Edwin, walks by your door, humming off key and swinging a pouch of teeth like a man pleased with his day's haul. You wince mostly from the sight of it, partly from the residual ache where your own tooth used to be. You remember the sound his tool made, a kind of crunch grind pop that you'll hear again in your dreams? It was made by what might be the most infamous dental instrument of the medieval period, the tooth key. If you're imagining something small and subtle like a key to a jewelry box, think again. This was an iron device shaped like the capital letter tipped with a claw at one end, meant to hook around the base of a tooth. The practitioner would insert it into the mouth, twist it hard, and wrench the offending molar free, often breaking nearby teeth or the jaw in the process. No wonder your jaw feels like it's been kicked by a mule wearing chainmail. Even worse, that wasn't the only tool in Edwin's toolkit. Oh no, he also carried forceps, not the sleek stainless steel ones your modern dentist might use, but more like blacksmith pincers repurposed with hopeful optimism. They were heavy crude and designed for grip, not finesse. And if the tooth was reluctant, say it had fused into the jawbone or was too rotted to grab, then out came the chisel. Yes, really. A small flat wedge of metal paired with a mallet. The tooth would be split in half or even broken into pieces, which were then pulled out bit by bit like oysters from a very hostile shell. Historians still debate whether the tooth key was an advancement in dental care or simply a uniquely medieval form of revenge disguised as medicine. What's certain is that it became widespread across Europe from the 14th century onward. In skilled hands, it might spare you a full jaw fracture. In Edwin's hands, well, you're still counting the damage. You begin to understand something peculiar. These tools weren't designed for healing. They were built for speed. You didn't go to the barber surgeon to preserve your smile, you went to stop the pain. Quickly. Brutally. It's no surprise, then, that some people took matters into their own hands, literally. Self-extraction stories are surprisingly common in medieval lore. One tale involves a shepherd who heated a small iron nail, jabbed it into his gums, and pried out the tooth with a spoon. The spoon didn't survive. The shepherd still chewing with the left side. There's even a recipe recorded in a 12th century German herbal book, describing how to soften a painful tooth until it willingly leaps from the mouth. Ingredients included burnt sage vinegar, powdered goat hoof, and the tail hair of a black cat. You're not sure what's worse, the ingredients or the implication that it sometimes worked. You pause to imagine how many toothless mouths must have walked the muddy streets of Europe. Smiles were uncommon. Teeth were tools, not ornaments. If they got in the way of eating, talking, or staying alive, they were removed. No one dreamed of whitening strips or alignment trays. The only alignment people cared about was making sure your mouth closed at all. And the tools reflected that priority. They weren't individualized. One set of forceps was used on every villager, often uncleaned. Infection a mystery. Germ theory centuries away. You simply hoped the last person wasn't oozing too much when they sat in the chair before you. Some barbers would rinse their instruments in wine or oil which they believed was cleansing. Historians still argue whether this had any real antiseptic value or just gave people false hope and very flammable mouths. You remember Edwin offering to sharpen the edge before starting? You now realize he meant the clamp, not the tool. Comforting. And still, despite the brutality, people lined up. The tools may have been crude, but the pain of doing nothing was worse. Abscesses, infections, and jaw rot weren't just unpleasant, they could be fatal. In a world where your average life expectancy hovered below 40, a single infected molar could turn into sepsis in days. You start to wonder, why didn't anyone invent something better? Well, someone tried. A few enterprising Renaissance-era medics began experimenting with thinner, more curved forceps and pressure-controlled clamps. But mass distribution was slow. The average village barber couldn't afford those luxuries, and besides, he had a perfectly good spoon and mallet system going. You glance at your reflection in a basin of water. There's dried blood on your chin. You dab at it with a linen scrap that used to be part of your shirt sleeve. Edwin says you're healing nicely. You're not sure whether that's based on experience or the fact that you haven't fainted in 24 hours. A small part of you wonders if maybe the tools weren't the problem. Maybe it's that people thought of the mouth as something best left alone until it betrayed you. Preventative care. Hilarious. Brushing your teeth. Some people chewed sticks or rubbed their gums with salt. That was about the extent of dental hygiene. So the next time you look at a toothbrush, remember you could have been chewing on burnt rosemary root, praying to St. Apollonia, and waiting for a man named Edwin to pull out your molar with a horseshoe. But hey, your face is still mostly symmetrical. You don't know it yet, but word has spread around the village. You're the one who survived Edwin's extraction without screaming, well, mostly. That's prestige in these parts. You're now unofficially the brave one, which mostly means people keep asking to look at your jaw like it's some kind of relic. A neighbor knocks on your door. He's brought ale. You assume it's for sympathy. But no, he just wants to know if Edwin held you down or if you went limp like a potato sack. You assure him you did your best impression of a brave sack. Here's the truth that no one wants to admit: the dental tools weren't the most terrifying part of medieval tooth care. It was the fact that you had to be still during all of it. Because once that key or chisel was inside your mouth, one twitch, one panic flinch, and something was coming out sideways, possibly your jaw. So how did they make people stay still? Well, you didn't go in alone. Medieval dentistry was in many ways a team sport. You were often held down not by straps, but by other people. A friend, a family member, or an unusually strong monk would help pin your shoulders and head. If you were lucky, someone pressed their hand against your forehead and whispered calming nonsense like "this will be over in a moment," or "may God be merciful." Spoiler, it was never just a moment, and God was usually busy. Children were restrained more tightly, partly because they were more likely to thrash, and partly because, let's face it, medieval adults had very little faith in medieval children. Some practitioners used wooden mouth props to keep the jaw open. These were carved wedges jammed between the molars so the mouth wouldn't close mid-extraction. If that sounds like a choking hazard, congratulations, your instincts are correct. Historians still argue whether such props were common across Europe or more of a regional innovation. Some speculate that they originated with traveling toothmen who wanted speed and less mess at the cost of the occasional unconscious patient. In many households, a strong drink was the first line of defense. A lay mead or sometimes brandywine would be served as a pain-dulling agent. It didn't numb much, but it made people slower, more compliant, not unlike sleepwalking into a guillotine. Prayer was another strategy. Patients were often encouraged to recite a psalm or prayer, sometimes aloud, sometimes silently during the procedure. This wasn't just spiritual encouragement. It was a way to keep the mouth open and distract the brain from the rising panic. Some barbers sang. Yes, you read that correctly. They would hum or chant in rhythm with their work. Supposedly this helped with pacing, pull, twist, breathe, pull. More likely it served to drown out the sounds of pain and crunching. A medieval form of elevator music, except the elevator is on fire and you're inside it. If you were high status, you might have a cushion. Perhaps even a chair with a backrest. For most villages, you sat on a stool, maybe a barrel if you were fortunate, and held on to whatever dignity you had left. Some bit down on leather straps, others on wooden spoons. The truly unlucky used nothing at all. And then, of course, there was fainting. Passing out mid-extraction wasn't considered dangerous. In fact, it was encouraged. You were less trouble unconscious. Several 13th century illustrations show people slumped over with a tooth key still in place, their bodies being propped up by assistants or amused bystanders. In fact, some patients were intentionally knocked out. A well-aimed elbow or a short slap to the temple could buy the practitioner 30 seconds of unopposed wrenching. Not ethical by today's standards, but efficiency was the goal. You begin to appreciate just how much dentistry was about management, not just of the teeth, but of fear movement and timing. A successful extraction required coordination, a certain rhythm, and ideally a patient who didn't flail. There's even a documented technique from 15th century Italy in which the barber had his apprentice distract the patient by shouting insults at them mid-procedure. The idea was that emotional shock would dull the pain. There's no word on whether it worked, but it certainly made for a colorful waiting room. Edwin, you realize, never said much during your procedure. Just grunted and hummed like he was kneading bread. But you now remember a strange moment someone held your shoulder. Not roughly gently. Maybe it was that apprentice of his, the skinny one with the lopsided hair. Or maybe it was your neighbor Margaret sneaking in to make sure you didn't faint onto her clogs. Either way it helped. Even a little. You shift your jaw and test the pain. It's still there like a bruise wrapped in twine, but manageable. You stretch and for the first time in days you yawn. It's lopsided and ends in a wince, but it's still a yawn. Progress. You wrap your cloak tighter around your shoulders and glance toward the fire. It's low now, flickering lazily. Tomorrow someone else will take the stool. Someone else will taste iron and then leather and salt. And you'll be the one standing behind hand on their shoulder, whispering nonsense and hoping it helps. Because in the Middle Ages, no one gets through a dental extraction alone. Morning again. Your jaw still throbs, but it's more of a sullen throb now, like a teenager being forced to attend church. It's not gone, but it's quieter. You chew slowly on a mash of bread and broth, wondering how much longer you'll need to live on wet food. Margaret stops by with another suggestion, herbs. She hands you a bundle tied in twine, dried leaves, pungent and slightly damp. Boil it, breathe it, rub it on your gums, she says. You don't ask questions. Welcome to medieval pain management. In a world where your options for anesthesia range from alcohol to blind faith herbs, we're considered a middle ground between medicine and magic. People believe plants held power, sometimes divine, sometimes demonic, but always interesting. Your little bundle, likely a mix of sage, mint, rosemary, and possibly ground-up bark, all of which you're meant to inhale, steep, or chew possibly all at once. One of the most famous toothache remedies in the Middle Ages was clove oil. It came from imported cloves often traded at a high cost along the spice routes. If you could afford it, and that was a big if it worked. Modern science backs this up, Eugenol. The active compound in clove oil actually does have numbing properties. So congratulations, medieval people, you accidentally got that one right. Other treatments were less, let's say, elegant. Garlic was a staple. Crush it into a paste, rub it directly on the gums. Did it help? Maybe. Or maybe the smell just made people back away fast enough that you forgot your pain. Some recipes added honey, not for taste, but as a mild antiseptic. Historians still argue whether these herbal approaches were passed down through careful oral tradition or just desperate improvisation. One German herbal from the 11th century recommends soaking a frog in vinegar and applying it gently to the sore tooth. No context, no explanation, just frog. In rural villages, apothecaries might prescribe powdered myrrh, powdered root, or even powdered deer antler mixed with wine. You'd swish it around your mouth until it burned with holy fire, and then ideally the toothache went away or your nerve endings simply gave up. Let's not forget urine. Yes, human urine, especially that of a pure child, was believed to carry healing properties. It was sometimes gargled, sometimes applied to the jaw and cloth. You shudder just thinking about it. Margaret once told you about a woman who used goat urine instead. You don't ask how that worked out. You light a small fire and hang a pot over it, placing Margaret's herb bundle into the water. A sharp earthy smell rises, a blend of damp leaves and faint hope. You lean over and breathe in. It doesn't do much for the pain, but your sinuses feel very awake. Some remedies were more ritual than medicinal. You'd be told to recite a charm cross yourself 3 times, then bite into a piece of bread while facing east. Or rub a pebble against your sore tooth, then bury it under a yew tree. Folk wisdom or placebo? Possibly both. One charm recorded in Anglo-Saxon England involves writing the words abracadabra in a triangle shape and wearing it around your neck until the toothache goes away. You're tempted to try it, if only because abracadabra feels oddly appropriate for this whole experience. More ambitious households kept herbal manuscripts, often copied by hand by monks. These were full of diagrams, recipes, and notes in Latin. You've seen one once. The illustrations were creative. One page showed a man with a giant tooth fighting a snake. Another had an angel poking a molar with a feather. Artistic license was very much alive. But even with all these rituals and remedies, most people knew once the pain really settled and herbs couldn't help. They soothed, distracted, maybe bought you time. But eventually it always came back to Edwin or someone like him waiting with his tooth key in his iron stomach. You glance at your stew, it's mostly liquid, with a few chunks of something fibrous and hopefully edible. You take a bite on the left side of your mouth very carefully. Some villages believed certain foods triggered toothaches: cold milk, undercooked bread, too many radishes. Others thought emotions played a role: anger, jealousy, even dreams. If you dreamed of worms, someone might say a toothache was coming. Which brings us to an uncomfortable idea. What if the ache isn't entirely physical? You've heard whispers about mouth spirits. Tiny beings that live in your teeth, feeding on bad thoughts or sins left unspoken. Some believed humming softly or reciting psalms while eating would keep them at bay. Edwin thinks that's ridiculous, but he also thinks swallowing a coin can buy off mouth demons. So take that as you will. You swirl the herb water one more time and dab it against your gum with a scrap of cloth. The taste is bitter, the smell sharp but oddly comforting. Like you're doing something even if it's not doing much. You rest your head back against the wall, feeling the warmth of the fire, the pressure in your jaw fading to a dull throb. It's not gone. But it's yours now, familiar. Like a neighbor who never leaves but stops knocking after a while. Outside, someone is screaming. Another tooth, another stool, another cup of ale. You'll bring the herbs. You don't respond to the scream outside. Not because you don't care, but because you do, deeply empathetically and with a level of dread that prevents movement. That scream high and raw tells you exactly what part of the procedure Edwin has reached. The twist, the pop, the moment when someone realizes too late that they should have tried the onion poultice instead. You poke at your cheek. The swelling is down, but the hole is still there. Raw, sensitive, like the memory of a betrayal. You've applied every herb you can find. You've prayed. You've sat silently under a tree chewing on mint leaves like some kind of contemplative cow, but nothing quite removes the ache the way a little bloodletting does. Yes, bloodletting. It sounds like a punishment, but in medieval medicine it was the go-to remedy for just about everything. Fever bleed, sadness bleed, stub toe probably bleed just in case. And for dental pain. Oh yes, bleeding was absolutely on the menu. The idea was simple. The human body in all its mysterious glory was thought to be ruled by the 4 humors: blood phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If one was out of balance, illness followed. Too much blood pain, swelling, inflammation in your jaw, that throbbing was your body screaming, "There's too much blood in here, let it out." So you did. Your barber surgeon naturally offered this service as well. The same Edwin who pulled your tooth will for a small fee nick your vein and let your blood flow into a ceramic bowl decorated, of course. Edwin is nothing if not festive. You remember lying back, wrist exposed. The prick of a blade not meant for precision. The warmth as blood slid out sluggish and dark. There was a faint ringing in your ears, a sense of floating as if your pain was slowly draining with your blood. That might have been real. Or it might have been dizziness from losing a pint of fluid in a room with no ventilation. Historians still argue whether bloodletting provided any genuine relief, or merely served as a deeply distracting spectacle. Some suggest the drop in blood pressure may have temporarily dulled pain. Others argue the placebo effect did most of the work. You suspect it's somewhere in the middle, like everything in the Middle Ages, just enough truth to be dangerous. There were specific veins to target depending on your ailment. For toothaches, the cephalic vein in the arm was most common, but some particularly enthusiastic practitioners recommended behind the ear. One barber even swore by nicking the ankle. You chose the arm. That seemed far enough from your brain. The procedure wasn't always done with a blade. Leeches were common, too. Edwin didn't keep any, thank God, but a neighbor Elsbeth swears by hers. She keeps 3 in a jar named Peace, Quiet, and Roger. She says they calm the blood. You avoid eye contact with her now. It wasn't just humans getting the bleeding treatment. Horses, dogs, even goats were bled to balance their temperaments. A moody goat must be full of bad blood. And you post-toothache were apparently just another grumpy mammal in need of draining. After the bloodletting, Edwin gave you advice that still lingers. Rest, don't chew, and don't think angry thoughts, which seems almost charming until you realize anger was considered one of the emotional causes of imbalance. The body was as much an emotional creature as it was physical. A bitter heart led to bitter blood, and bitter blood led to abscesses. You spent the next day sipping broth, lying flat, feeling your heartbeat slow back to something reasonable. The ache dulled further, not gone but quieter like a storm moving farther out to sea. Then came the poultices. Elsbeth brought you one. It smelled like fermented straw and desperation. She wouldn't say what was in it. You didn't ask. You packed it against your jaw and waited. The pain flared, then cooled. Your skin prickled. You tried not to think about what you might be absorbing. Herbs mold witchcraft. But still, Sid helped. The human mouth, they say, heals faster than most parts of the body. And yet it's also a trapdoor to a dozen different kinds of death. Infections here go deep fast. Without antibiotics, the best defense was vigilance prayer and a good poultice. You learned to sleep upright. You rinsed with wine when you had it. You refused anything crunchy. At one point, Edwin offered to burn the hole shut, a method he'd read about in a French scroll that involved hot iron and an alarming amount of confidence. You declined firmly. The swelling faded. The ache became an echo. And still you bled. Once more a little? Just enough to freshen the spirit. It's oddly calming now, the ritual of it. You're not even sure it works, but like herbs and prayers, it's part of the rhythm of surviving in a world where your molars can try to kill you. You hear a knock. It's the boy who screamed earlier. His jaw is wrapped in cloth, his eyes watery, but he nods at you with a kind of shared knowing. First one you ask. He nods again. You hand him what's left of your herb bundle. Breathe this. Don't bite the spoon. He gives a ghost of a smile, then turns and limps off. Another recruit in the long, strange battle of medieval dental survival. That night you sleep better than you have in a week. It's not the herbs, not the bloodletting. It's the absence of anticipation. You're no longer waiting for the pain to come. You're past it. The worst has already happened. Well, probably. But as you stretch and rub your tender jaw the next morning, a new thought creeps in, one that makes you sit up a little straighter. What if the pain comes back? What if there's still something wrong, something deeper? That's when someone probably, Elsbeth again casually drops a phrase into conversation over shared porridge. Must be the toothworm. You blink. The what? The toothworm, she says, as though it's self-evident. It burrows into the tooth, wriggles around. That's what causes the pain. Everyone knows that. And she's not joking. In fact, this idea of the toothworm was one of the most persistent dental theories in the medieval world. Ancient Sumerians believed it. So did the Greeks, the Chinese, and much of Europe well into the 18th century. The logic was charming in its simplicity. You feel a wriggling pain, therefore something must be wriggling. A small, invisible worm, a resident pest that lives inside your tooth, slowly gnawing its way through the enamel until your molar cracks like an overcooked bean. And once you think about it, well, now your jaw tingles all over again. Is that pressure or movement? To cure the worm, people devised all kinds of delightful methods. One popular remedy involved smoke. The theory was that if you held burning henbane or other foul-smelling herbs near the open mouth, the smoke would irritate the worm and draw it out. You picture yourself mouth-open smoke swirling up into your sinuses while a crowd gathers to watch yet again. Tooth pulling is one thing, worm smoking. That's an entirely different level of public spectacle. And it did become a performance in many places. Traveling dentists, or more accurately toothmen, would set up shop in town squares. Dressed in colorful clothing with jangly belts and feathered hats, they'd perform extractions and worm removals for the crowd. Some even claimed to show the worm after the procedure, revealing a tiny maggot or bit of thread and declaring victory. Historians still argue whether these worms were ever real, probably not, or if they were props used to convince patients of success. Some scholars suggest these were sleight-of-hand tricks. Others believe there might have been tooth debris, or even tiny eels, yes, eels, introduced for show. Regardless, the people believed, and belief in the absence of anesthesia was a powerful drug. You ask around. Apparently your village had its own worm caller once. An old woman named Hedra, who passed away a few winters ago. She claimed to be able to speak to the worms, persuading them to leave without causing pain. You wish she were still around. Even if she just talked to your jaw for a few hours, it might be nice. You find yourself staring into the fire again, thinking about worms, imagining them with tiny expressions of guilt. A whole colony hiding behind your molars, whispering apologies. Some remedies took the idea further. It wasn't just about smoking them out, it was about starving them. Fasting, they said, made the worms weak. Reciting prayers in Latin that confused them. One recipe recommends biting on a twig of ash tree while singing a psalm to Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of teeth. Yes, Saint Apollonia again. She appears often in these stories, often depicted holding pliers with a tooth in them. Why? Because according to legend, she was tortured by having her teeth broken out, making her the ideal spiritual consultant for dental anguish. You feel oddly comforted by this. She gets it. You light a sprig of rosemary and wave it near your mouth more out of curiosity than conviction. The smoke curls and bites at your nostrils. No worms leap out. You're both relieved and disappointed. Elsbeth stops by and sees you mid-smoke ritual. She nods solemnly. Smart, she says. Worms hate rosemary. You don't correct her. What's the point? You've come to understand that pain in this world is something you share with others, not necessarily to solve it, but to survive it. Whether it's bleeding herbs, prayers, or smoke rituals, it's the collective acknowledgement of your suffering that matters most. You're not alone with your aching jaw. You're part of a centuries-old community of sore-mouthed survivors. Later that day, you meet an old man named Willem. He grins at you with exactly 3 teeth, none of which point in the same direction. You get it pulled, he asks. You nod. He reaches into his cloak and pulls out a small rounded pebble. Bite on this next time. Keep the worms busy. You thank him and take the pebble, though you're unsure whether to bite it, bury it, or add it to the soup. That night you place it under your pillow, just in case. By now your tooth hole is starting to close. The pain is more like a memory, a slightly angry one, but manageable. You're no longer drinking your broth through clenched teeth or flinching at sunlight. Still the fear lingers like a ghost hiding behind your last remaining molars. You've survived the village dentist, but what if you were royalty? You lean back, imagining yourself not as a scruffy peasant sleeping in a straw-stuffed cot, but as a king, robed in velvet, eating roasted quail, sipping wine from a goblet that sparkles in the firelight. Surely kings had better dentists, right? Sort of. Turns out being royal didn't make toothaches disappear. In fact, some monarchs had notoriously bad teeth, largely because they could afford sugar. Sugar, the precious white gold of the medieval elite, was ground stirred into drinks, baked into pies, and happily crammed into royal mouths with little thought for what came next. Take Queen Elizabeth I, for example. Though she reigned a bit later than our current village fantasy, she was famous for her blackened, decayed teeth, a consequence of both sugar and clove-studded indulgence. Court reports mention her terrible breath and her refusal to allow anyone to look in her mouth. Which brings us to the problem when your boss is the king and he has a toothache. You don't just yank the molar and hope for the best. You proceed with caution. Most royal courts had physicians' men educated in Latin, steeped in the works of Galen, and deeply confused about how the human body actually functioned. They weren't dentists, but they tried. Their treatments were fancier, sure gold forceps instead of rusted iron, silk cloths instead of rags, but the principles were still pretty medieval. Bloodletting, herbal poultices, and in extreme cases, extraction. There's a famous tale about Louis XIV of France having several teeth pulled in one sitting without anesthesia. He fainted. Twice. They broke his jaw. For days, courtiers whispered about it while dabbing at their own tender gums. Even wealth couldn't buy comfort. That said, being a king did offer a few perks. If your tooth was hurting, you could command silence across the palace. You could summon multiple physicians and pit them against each other in a kind of low-stakes, high-suffering tournament. The winner got paid. The loser often also got paid, but with fewer perks and more side-eye. One royal record describes a procedure in which heated gold tweezers were used to purify the tooth before removal. Historians still debate whether this helped or just added second-degree burns to the patient's problems. And it wasn't just kings. Queens suffered too, though their stories were often tucked discreetly away behind more acceptable ailments like nervous headaches or melancholia. Because nothing says elegance like admitting your molar is throbbing and you're trying to act regal with half your face swollen. You picture a scene, a royal banquet, gold and silver on every table. And at the head the king sits with one cheek slightly puffed, chewing only on the left side, trying not to wince as the jester makes tooth jokes. Why do kings never smile? The jester quips, juggling apples. Because their crowns don't fit inside their mouths. He's lucky to survive the evening. Of course, if you were really rich, you might be able to skip the procedure altogether. A few aristocrats opted for gold-plated covers instead of extractions. Decorative tooth caps, often covering rotting stumps, allowed them to continue attending court functions with dignity and just a faint hint of gangrene. Then there were charms. Royals wore amulets, carried saints' relics, or kept pieces of parchment with prayers tucked under their pillows. St. Apollonia made frequent appearances here too. A few kings had chapels dedicated to her. Some even commissioned tiny shrines just for their dental woes. One Renaissance ruler insisted that all court musicians play soothing tunes outside his chambers when he was dealing with a sore tooth. Lutes, harps, occasionally a gentle tambourine. Nothing screams dental emergency like a courtly lullaby. You pull your blanket closer, amused and slightly horrified. At least you weren't expected to look majestic while drooling. And yet, the core experience wasn't that different. Whether you're a king or a baker, a monk or a goat herder, when your tooth aches, everything else fades into the background. Your identity doesn't matter. Your rank doesn't matter. What matters is the pulse of pressure in your jaw and the desperate hope that anyone knows what to do. You glance at the little pebble Willem gave you. It's still under your pillow. For luck, for balance, for the worms if they're listening. You hold it in your hand and whisper, "I am not a king, but my mouth is mine." Then you laugh, softly, carefully. And you sleep. You wake slowly, with the faint sense that something's missing. The ache. No, still there, faint and dull, like an old drum beat under a thick blanket. It's something else. A presence. A ritual. And then it hits you, you haven't prayed to anyone yet today, not even Saint Apollonia. You sit up feeling your jaw with tender fingers. The hole is healing, but superstition sticks harder than scabs. You nod to yourself, then reach under your blanket for the little wooden icon carved with a saint's face. It's a crude likeness, 2 eyes, no mouth, but it's yours. Saint Apollonia, patron of toothaches and dental suffering, looms large in your world, even if you've never technically met her. Her story, passed down by candlelight and slightly too dramatic monks, tells of a devout woman in 3rd century Alexandria. During a violent anti-Christian purge, she refused to renounce her faith. In retaliation, her persecutors shattered her teeth and threatened to burn her alive unless she recanted. She smiled and jumped into the flames herself. Brutal, yes, but the Middle Ages loved saints with flair. Because of her martyrdom, Apollonia became the heavenly hotline for anyone whose jaw was throbbing. Paintings show her calmly holding a pair of pliers, often with a disembodied tooth still clamped inside. She looks serene, which is impressive considering her dental history. Most villages had at least one shrine statue or image of her. Yours has a little niche in the church wall with a faded fresco. You've seen people slip notes under it or leave little offerings, bread crusts, broken combs, even baby teeth. You head there now feeling the cool morning air bite your nose. The chapel is quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your own heartbeat sound like an impatient squirrel. You kneel, whisper a few words, and press the little icon to your lips. Do you believe? You're not sure. But it doesn't matter. Belief in this case is less about miracles and more about the comfort of routine. If Apollonia can't heal you, maybe she can at least keep Edwin's hands from slipping. Interestingly, she wasn't the only saint associated with teeth. Some regions prayed to St. Gengulphus, a lesser-known martyr with a penchant for strange ailments. Others turned to St. Blaise, protector of throats and mouths. And then there were local folk saints, never officially canonized but widely adored, who specialized in very specific pains. Historians still argue how much these saints were based on real people versus community-constructed coping mechanisms. But either way, their presence was real. They lived in the spaces between the pain, between the clove paste, and the tooth key, between the prayer and the scream. You remember your friend Agnes once claimed that sleeping with a fish bone under your pillow would summon Apollonia in your dreams. You tried it. All you got was a very fishy pillow and a strange dream involving a tooth with legs. But the desire for divine intervention makes sense. In a world with no antibiotics, no painkillers, and few clean tools, you needed someone watching over your jaw. And who better than a woman who literally had her teeth shattered and still chose her own fate? You return home and find Elsbeth waiting on your stoop. She's brought blessed ash, which she says will help keep the socket clean. You ask who blessed it. She hesitates, then mutters, "My cousin." You nod solemnly. The ash smells like burnt barley and pipe smoke. You sprinkle a little in a cloth and press it gently to your face. It itches, but you feel vaguely protected. Later, you sit by the fire and dig through your small wooden chest. You find your own modest collection of charms, a copper ring with strange symbols, a sprig of dried sage, a scrap of parchment with faded writing. You lay them out on the floor like cards in a game. Each one has a story, a superstition, a whisper of protection. You pick up the copper ring and slide it onto your finger. It's said to bind the root of pain, though no one remembers who first said it. You like the way it warms to your skin. Nearby, the little icon of Apollonia sits on the shelf. You swear she's looking at you more kindly today. You nod to her. "Thanks," you say. "Just keep the other teeth in place, yeah?" No answer, of course. But the ache in your jaw doesn't get worse. And in the Middle Ages, that's basically a miracle. By midday, you're back to chewing gingerly, slowly, always on the left side. It's a cautious sort of triumph, the kind that only someone who's recently dodged an infection of the face can appreciate. You allow yourself a smile. Not a full smile, of course. That would be foolish. But a small, careful curl of the lip. And then you hear it. A scream. Sharp, brief, with a kind of desperate punctuation. It cuts through the sound of birds and market chatter like a blade through dough. Someone's at it again. You shuffle toward the square, drawn more by instinct than interest. That scream could be anything, but by now you know a dental cry from a stubbed toe or a tax collector sighting. Sure enough, there's a small cluster near Edwin's stall. A boy maybe 16 is clutching his face sitting on the extraction stool. Edwin stands nearby, gesturing toward his table like a street magician about to pull a molar out of a hat. But what catches your eye isn't the boy, it's the table. For the first time you notice the other tools. Not the forceps or tooth keys you're familiar with, but strange-looking items, a flat paddle carved from bone, a loop of braided metal, a small horn cup, and something that resembles a shrimp fork from the fever dream. These apparently are for other kinds of mouth treatments, because not every dental problem ends with a yanked tooth. Sometimes the cure was a paste. You remember hearing about them. Recipes passed down from wandering apothecaries or half-trained monks, thick, gritty mixtures meant to be packed into a rotting tooth to draw out the poison. Some used myrrh. Others used ash-powdered bone or ground snail shell. Historians still argue whether these pastes had any antiseptic effect or whether they just delayed the inevitable. What's clear is that the intent wasn't to heal the tooth. It was to make it bearable a little longer. By a day a week, maybe a month before the pain returned with its friends. You overhear Edwin muttering about a poultice and a prayer. He mixes something in a small stone bowl with the enthusiasm of a man making soup for someone he doesn't like very much. The boy winces but doesn't run. Brave soul. Then Edwin picks up the horn cup. This is new. You sidle closer, pretending to admire a nearby cabbage. You've heard stories of these devices, tiny suction tools pressed to the gum to draw out ill humors. You'd always assumed they were exaggerated. They weren't. The boy leans back. Edwin places the cup inside his mouth, applies pressure, and mutters something about releasing vapors. It sounds impressive. It probably isn't. But you understand the instinct behind it. Medieval medicine was obsessed with removing things blood phlegm, bad air, evil spirits, and pain was viewed not as something to manage, but something to purge. Through vomiting, bleeding, sweating, or in this case, suction. Some more enterprising healers used hot stones pressed to the jaw. Others recommended steam either from boiling water or bizarrely heated dung. Yes, animal dung. The theory was that its natural warmth would calm the nerve, or distract you long enough to forget the toothache. You saw someone try it once. He hasn't smiled since. There were also powders, finely ground substances that could be blown into the mouth through a narrow reed, usually ash or burnt bread, occasionally crushed wasp nest. The idea was to dry the rot. You wonder if anyone ever choked during that particular procedure. You're certain they did. You step back from Edwin's display, your stomach a little uneasy. And yet, part of you is curious, not because you want more dental pain, but because you now understand just how creative people became when desperate. You think of Margaret, who once stuck a sliver of silver into her gum for purity, or Elsbeth, who briefly wore a tiny iron key around her neck because someone told her it would lock the jaw demons out. You think of yourself gently rinsing with wine and praying to a saint whose icon came from a traveling monk who smelled like onions and regret. This is how people lived. Not with certainty, but with ritual. Not with answers, but with repetition. The boy finishes his treatment. He spits. The crowd murmurs. Edwin looks satisfied more from the spectacle than the success. You catch the boy's eye. He's pale, sweaty, and grateful to be upright. You'll be fine, you say. Didn't even pull it, he mutters. You nod. Sometimes that's the win. He limps away, mouth packed with something that smells of lavender and old bread. You watch Edwin clean his horn cup with a bit of wine and a rag. He lines up his tools again, neat rows of strange metal and wood. You walk home suddenly aware of the quiet in your jaw, the calm. And you wonder not how you survived your toothache, but how many people didn't. The wind picks up that afternoon, rattling the shutters and sending a few stray feathers tumbling across the square. You stay indoors, crouched by the hearth, poking at a bowl of stewed leeks with a spoon that still smells faintly of clove oil. It's a quiet day, and for once your jaw isn't the center of attention. But across the fire, your uncle starts telling a story, one you've heard before, but which always sticks with you. It's about a woman in a town not far from yours. Her teeth were so rotten that her breath could fell a goose at 30 paces. An exaggeration, obviously. Probably. But it paints a vivid picture. In the Middle Ages, tooth decay wasn't just painful, it was social suicide. Bad breath-missing teeth and blackened gums made it hard to speak, smile, or eat in public. You became quite literally a walking warning. Some people tried to fight this with cleanliness. They chewed herbs, fennel, mint, parsley. Others rinsed with wine or vinegar. A few rubbed their teeth with linen cloths dipped in salt or powdered oyster shell. It helped a little. But in a world without modern dentistry, decay was inevitable. Which is why, eventually, you'd need dentures. Yes, medieval dentures. And no, they weren't the pink plastic kind your grandfather keeps in a glass. These were creative. Some were made of wood, carved carefully, fitted roughly, and secured with thread or wire. Others were fashioned from animal bone, often sheep or ox, and polished smooth. And then there were the unsettling ones, dentures made from human teeth taken from the recently deceased. Historians still debate whether these dead man's teeth were harvested ethically or simply plucked from corpses on battlefields. What's certain is that tooth traders existed, moving from town to town with small pouches of molars and incisors ready to sell you a smile. You remember a story about an old man who wore a mismatched set, one row of carved ivory, the other real teeth, probably not his. When he laughed, they clicked like dice in a cup. And yet people wore them proudly. Better a rattling grin than a collapsed face. Dentures didn't just restore appearance, they allowed you to eat, speak, and even court. A full set of teeth, however fake, meant status, but the process wasn't comfortable. Fitting dentures in the Middle Ages involved heat wax wires and a disturbing lack of anesthesia. The false teeth had to be molded, tied, and often retied after they shifted. Some were kept in place with tension from the jaw. Others required straps around the head, an elegant look to be sure. One Flemish merchant wrote in his diary about the constant tickle of his new teeth. He eventually removed them during meals, storing them in a small leather pouch at his belt. His wife was said to prefer him toothless. And let's not forget the materials. In addition to wood and bone, some wealthy individuals commissioned metal dentures, gold, silver, even lead. The latter caused more problems than it solved, slowly poisoning the wearer. But hey, it looked fancy. A few even had teeth inlaid with gems, tiny rubies, or garnets worn more for show than function. You imagine biting into a plum and leaving a ruby behind. Very dignified. What's remarkable is not that people tried to make dentures, but that they succeeded sometimes. A well-fitted set paired with a strong jaw and a bit of glue or resin could last months, maybe years, if you were careful, if you didn't sneeze too hard. You touch your own mouth where the tooth once was. Could you wear false teeth? Would you? The idea is less ridiculous than it used to be. After all, survival is a series of compromises. You give up one thing to keep another. A molar for a meal, a little dignity for a full plate. Later that day, you meet a man named Thomas, who smiles at you with surprising confidence. You notice it immediately: his teeth. Too even, too bright, too complete. You ask. He grins wider. Birch, he says, tapping one. Shaved and oiled, fitted by a traveling Dutchman, paid 4 chickens. You admire the craftsmanship, even as he winces with each word. Can't eat meat, though, he adds. Or bread, or soup that's too thick. Mostly I hum and pretend. But he looks happy, or at least pleased with the illusion. And maybe that's the point. Dentures weren't about chewing. They were about being seen. Smiling in church, laughing at jokes, showing that you'd fought decay and in some small way won. You bid Thomas farewell and return home running your tongue over your empty socket. It feels less hollow now, less like a wound and more like a space with history. One day maybe you'll fill it, or maybe not. Maybe you'll let it be. A reminder of the pain, the poultices, the prayers, and the quiet pride of surviving it all. That evening, after sharing a quiet meal of root vegetables and slightly overcooked barley, you lie on your cot and breathe deeply. The pain is mostly memory now. You probe the socket with your tongue gingerly and feel the soft puckered ridge of healing flesh. You've made it through. But as you relax, another memory surfaces: the smell. Not from your own mouth, but from others. The breath of your neighbors, your uncle, even Edwin, each carrying a scent you'd grown used to. Acrid, sour, at times almost swampy. You realize with a slight shudder that this was the real horror of medieval dental care: the breath. It wasn't just unpleasant, it was in some cases genuinely dangerous. You see, rotting teeth weren't just a cosmetic issue, they were potential gateways to something far worse. Infections that began as a dull throb could creep inward, burrow down, and reach the bloodstream. There's a name for it today: Ludwig's angina, a severe, often fatal infection of the floor of the mouth. Back then it was called jaw rot, or more ominously, face-melting fever. You had seen it before: a man named Jarek who ran the tannery just outside the village. He began with a simple abscess in his lower molar. Refused treatment. Thought he could wait it out with wine and clove paste. By the time he sought Edwin, the swelling had spread beneath his tongue. He couldn't eat, couldn't talk. Eventually he couldn't breathe. Jarek died gasping for air, his face swollen beyond recognition. Edwin never spoke of it again. Historians still debate how often these infections led to death, but the risk was real and terrifying. In an age without antibiotics, your body either fought the infection or it didn't. There were no second chances. And yet the belief lingered that breath itself held magical or spiritual significance. In many cultures, foul breath was seen as a sign of inner sin. People believed that shame, envy, or dishonesty could rot your teeth from the inside out. Priests sometimes prescribed confession for toothaches, convinced that spiritual cleansing would help physical healing. You smile wryly. Your confession would have included stealing bread, cursing Edwin under your breath, and nearly slapping Elsbeth for suggesting goat urine again. Other theories blame bad air miasmas. These invisible poisons believed to float through the night like smoke were thought to enter the mouth and putrefy the teeth. People covered their faces with cloth soaked in vinegar. They burned herbs. Some slept with garlic tied to their wrists. One particularly creative remedy involved placing a live frog against the cheek, under the theory that it would draw out the foulness. The frog presumably did not consent. Despite these odd beliefs, people tried to help each other. You recall neighbors offering advice, herbs, even prayers. Elsbeth once sang you a song in Latin she barely understood, hoping the rhythm would soothe the jaw spirit. It didn't, but it made you laugh, which helped in its own way. There were even early attempts at surgery. A brave few, usually monks with some anatomical training, attempted to drain abscesses with heated needles or crude scalpels. The goal was to release the buildup of pus before it spread. The results mixed and not often survivable. You've heard stories of tooth demons being exorcised. A monk named Brother Anselm was said to have cured a man's abscess by reading scripture aloud while poking his gum with a crucifix. The man fainted. The demon apparently fled. More often, though, people simply hoped the swelling would go down, that the herbs would work, that the rot would stay contained. You glance over at the small mirror shard hanging on your wall. Smile gently. Your breath isn't fresh, but it's not offensive. Not today. You rinse your mouth with lukewarm wine and rub your gums with salt as Edwin suggested. The routine feels strangely comforting now. You realize how much of medieval life was spent simply staving off decay, holding it back a day at a time, not defeating it, but coexisting with it. And you wonder, how did people fall in love with mouths like these? Did lovers avoid kissing? Or did they just accept that affection came with halitosis and occasional tooth extractions? Probably the latter. You lie back, eyes tracing the wooden beams of your ceiling. Somewhere a dog barks, a baby cries, a kettle hisses. Your jaw no longer hurts, but the lessons remain. You survived the tooth. And now you know, in the Middle Ages, every breath was a blessing and sometimes a biohazard. You're at the market the next morning, sniffing onions and pretending you don't care that your jaw still tingles when you laugh. The smell of dried fish mingles with the sharper notes of goat and unwashed humanity. It's oddly comforting. You survived a medieval dental ordeal, and now you're allowed to exist again in the bustling chaos of village life. And then you hear it. Not a scream this time, more of a whisper. Two old women muttering behind a stall piled with apples and possibly turnips. You catch just a fragment of their conversation. His teeth turned black from the plague. You inch closer. Turnips suddenly seem fascinating. This is a conversation about plague teeth, one of many superstitions that sprouted during the waves of the disease that rolled through Europe like particularly vindictive weather. During outbreaks of the Black Death, dental pain took on an almost mystical quality. A throbbing jaw wasn't just a nuisance, it was a warning, a sign, a curse. And the cures that sprang up in response were dramatic. One involved swallowing a mixture of crushed emerald and goat's milk. Another required shaving the head, then applying hot vinegar to the scalp while chewing on burnt rosemary. People slept with iron keys under their pillows, wore garlic necklaces, and painted their teeth with ashes to hide them from death. Historians still argue whether these rituals were based on genuine medical attempts or pure panic wrapped in folklore. Likely both. The line between doctor and witch healer and hustler was as blurry as your eyesight after a cup of questionable mead. You remember the story of old Marta, who claimed her husband's teeth had turned black just days before he coughed himself into the earth. Ever since she refuses to smile, says baring her teeth might attract the plague again. In some towns, people believed that a sudden toothache meant you'd walk through a cursed place, a field where a plague victim had been buried, or the shadow of a leper. Toothaches became omens, and teeth themselves were treated with almost religious suspicion. Which brings us to charms. During plague times, a whole new genre of protective amulets emerged, many involving teeth. People wore necklaces made from animal teeth, believing they'd distract death. Others hung human teeth over their doors, a sort of plague scarecrow to confuse evil spirits. You once met a tinker who swore his brass molar necklace kept him healthy. You weren't sure whether to be impressed or horrified. Probably both. Some people buried their loose teeth in the earth and planted onions over them, believing the onions would absorb sickness. Others placed their teeth in jars with vinegar and chalk, waiting for them to dissolve. If they didn't, it meant the tooth still held a ghost illness. You glance around the market, noting how many mouths are closed, how many cheeks seem slightly swollen. Maybe everyone's just cautious, or maybe they all know the stories. There's a reason no one talks too loudly about teeth here. It feels too close to cursing. Of course, the church had opinions on all this. Some priests warned against using animal teeth or pagan charms. Others embraced tooth relics, fragments of saints' jaws preserved in little glass cases said to offer divine protection. Pilgrims traveled hundreds of miles to kiss the glass and then whisper prayers. St. Apollonia, as always, was busy during these outbreaks. Her image appeared everywhere, from tiny woodcuts to full frescoes. One particularly dramatic mural you once saw featured her wielding a glowing molar like a weapon, her expression somewhere between pity and mild irritation. You can't blame her. By the time you return home, you've decided to inspect your own teeth again, just in case. The mirror shard is scratched and smudged, but you manage to catch a glimpse. Nothing black, nothing oozing, just teeth. Slightly uneven, a bit worn, but yours. And maybe that's the point. In an age when disease could arrive on the breath of a stranger, when superstition and science were still dating awkwardly, the tooth became more than a tool. It became a symbol of fear, of fate, of the body's betrayal. You run your tongue along your gum line and mutter a silent thank you to every charm prayer and clove-stuffed cloth that got you this far. Then you place a fresh onion on your windowsill. You're not superstitious, of course, but you're not taking any chances either. There's a buzz in the village square today, louder than usual and not entirely related to livestock or the price of barley. You follow the noise out of curiosity and find a small crowd gathered near the southern gate. At the center stands a man in a bright green tunic, a wide-brimmed hat tipped at a jaunty angle, and a wagon painted with flamboyant swirls of blue, red, and gold. His smile is broad, suspiciously white, and he has a set of tools laid out in front of him that make Edwin's table look like child's play. This is a traveling tooth man, a rare breed of medieval showman, equal parts barber performer and con artist. He's here for one reason, to yank teeth and make a little theater while doing it. You edge closer. He's already begun. The tooth man speaks with the polished rhythm of someone who's practiced this act dozens, maybe hundreds of times. His assistant, a boy with the posture of someone recently yelled at, holds a small brass bowl as the next patient steps forward. A woman with a pinched face and a grimace carved from years of hard bread and harder winters sits down. The tooth man makes a show of inspecting her mouth, gasps, mutters something about unholy rot. The crowd leans in. Then with a dramatic flourish, he reaches for a pair of gleaming tongs. It's a performance, no question, but the tooth pulling is real. You watch half fascinated, half horrified as he yanks with a practiced jerk and holds the offending molar aloft like a trophy. A few children cheer, someone faints. And then your favorite part, the reveal. The tooth man steps back and produces a small vial. From it he extracts a long, wiggly thing that looks suspiciously like a worm. Behold, he cries, the root of the rot, the demon of pain. He drops it into a bowl with a sizzle, probably vinegar, possibly magic. The crowd is delighted. You, however, recognize the trick. The tooth worm is a piece of string soaked in something foul-smelling, a prop, but it works. The woman smiles through her tears, holding a rag to her mouth. She believes. And for now, belief is enough. Historians still argue whether these performers were charlatans or community heroes. Some were scammers, no doubt, but others offered real relief in places where no formal healer would venture. Their methods were dramatic, but not always ineffective. Some traveled with testimonials, letters from barons or bishops praising their miraculous extractions. A few claimed to have trained in foreign lands or learned from ancient scrolls. Most of that was nonsense. But again, if the tooth stops hurting, who's counting? The tooth man gestures toward his wagon, offering curative powders, breath elixirs, and something he calls the silver blessing, a paste that supposedly keeps teeth white and demon-free. It smells like mint and something slightly medicinal. You almost buy a jar just for the jar. You remember stories of other traveling dentists who didn't fare so well. One man tried to pull a tooth from a knight and cracked the man's jaw. The knight returned 2 days later and pulled the dentist's cart apart with his bare hands. People say the cart creaked in protest the whole time. But today there's no violence, just relief and applause. The woman bows and stumbles away. The tooth man bows deeper. Then another volunteer steps forward. You glance at Edwin, who's watching from the edge of the square with the expression of a man being upstaged by a peacock. He mutters something under his breath and disappears into his shop. Later, you see him cleaning his tools with renewed vigor. The arrival of a traveling tooth man might not be great for local business, but it's undeniably good for morale. There's something about the spectacle, the shared horror and relief that binds a community. You think of the woman smiling despite her swollen cheek. You think of the child holding her hand. You think of your own visit to the stool, the clove, the prayer, the moment of peace after the pull. And you wonder, is the show really just for entertainment, or is it a form of healing too? Because in the end, what matters more, the actual treatment or the feeling that someone saw your pain and did something about it? As the crowd disperses, you catch the tooth man's eye. He nods. A small, almost humble gesture. You nod back. You both know. Sometimes pain is just pain. And sometimes it's a story waiting to be pulled. The square slowly empties, the echoes of laughter and wincing fading into the late afternoon haze. You head home through narrow lanes dusted with straw, past children sword fighting with turnips and old men arguing about goats and taxes, sometimes simultaneously. You reach your door open and breathe in the faint smell of ash and dried herbs. Inside, everything feels quieter than it did a few weeks ago before the tooth, before the poultices, before Edwin and the clove and the scream. You sit by the fire, fingers absently rubbing your jaw, not out of pain but habit. It's become a reflex now, a reminder that you've passed through something oddly significant. And in that stillness, it strikes you, you've become a kind of expert. You now understand more than you ever expected to about teeth. Their pain, their treatment, their myths, their worms. You know which herbs burn your tongue, which charms do absolutely nothing, and which tooth men are better actors than healers. You've also come to appreciate that dental suffering isn't just physical, it's emotional, social, spiritual. In medieval life, your mouth said everything: how you ate, how you spoke, how others judged you. A missing tooth could be a joke, a scar, or a stigma. And healing that wasn't just about infection, it was about reclaiming comfort. Routine. Soup without fear. You think of Edwin again, not as a villain, but as a man trying to hold back decay with iron tools and a grim sort of hope. He's part of a long chain of pain managers, some better than others, all improvising. Historians still argue whether medieval dental care caused more suffering than it prevented. You're not sure. But you are sure of this: everyone meant well, even the frog people. You pull your blanket closer. The fire crackles gently. In the distance you hear someone banging on wood. Another tooth, another long night. But not yours. Not tonight. You rest your head back. Your jaw twitches once faintly, but then it settles. Let's ease into that quiet now, slowly, gently. The fire's glow is soft and orange, flickering shadows on the walls like sleepy dancers. You feel its warmth on your toes, on your hands, along the curve of your jaw. Outside, the wind has slowed, brushing past rooftops like a sigh. Inside, everything stills. Your body, your breath, your thoughts like softened wax cooling into calm. The pain, once sharp and loud, is now just a folded memory tucked inside your smile. You've earned that smile, carefully, painfully, completely. You close your eyes. And you sleep.